pregnant Arapaho widow built a cabin with her bare hands until a rich cowboy saw her strength and everything changed. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The wind, a relentless sculptor of the plains, whispered through the sparse grasses, carrying with it the scent of dust and distant pine. Nayeli, her belly a gentle curve beneath the worn leather of her tunic, felt its cold kiss on her sweat-streaked brow. Each breath was a testament to the immense, crushing weight of her solitude, a solitude as vast and unforgiving as the land that stretched around her. Her hands, calloused and scraped, bled silent tributes to the earth, digging, lifting, shaping the rough-hewn logs that would one day become a home. This was not merely construction. It was an act of defiant creation, a fortress against the encroaching emptiness that threatened to swallow her whole. Every splinter was a memory, every aching muscle a thrum of grief for the man who should have been beside her, whose laughter used to chase away the silence. He was gone, a casualty of a world that cared little for the agreements made between men and the spirits of the earth. She was left with a seed of him, a promise swelling within her, and the raw, unyielding imperative to survive. The sun, a molten coin in the vast blue vault, beat down, offering no solace, only the unwavering truth of her monumental task. She worked until her vision blurred, until the horizon tilted and her knees threatened to buckle, driven by a primal urge that transcended exhaustion. There was no time for tears, no space for despair, only the rhythm of her labor: chop, drag, lift, place. The logs were heavy, each one a testament to the forest's ancient strength, a strength she now had to embody, to pull from the deepest, most shadowed corners of her being. She envisioned the walls rising, the roof spreading like protective wings, shielding her and the life nestled within. This cabin, this sacred space, would be more than wood and earth. It would be a monument to resilience, a beacon against the encroaching darkness. It was a silent conversation with her ancestors, a whispered promise to the child, yet to breathe the harsh air of this new, fractured world. The starkness of the landscape mirrored the starkness of her existence, yet within her, a tiny flame of hope flickered, fueled by the relentless beating of two hearts. The days bled into weeks, each marked by the incremental rise of the cabin walls, a visible triumph against the indifferent expanse. Nayeli moved with the deliberate grace of a seasoned hunter, her pregnant form surprisingly agile, adapting to the arduous demands. Her hands, though scarred, grew stronger, her muscles taut beneath her skin. She had learned to read the sky's moods, to feel the subtle shifts in the wind that foretold a storm, to listen to the distant rumble of thunder as a warning. Yet, there was another presence she began to sense, a ripple in the stillness that was not of the wind or the creatures of the land. It began as a faint impression, a shadow on the distant ridge, too regular to be an animal, too still to be a cloud. Her eyes, narrowed against the sun's glare, scanned the horizon, seeking the source of this unsettling sensation. It was a silhouette, a lone rider, sometimes stationary, sometimes moving with an unhurried confidence that spoke of ownership. He was always there, at the edge of her world, observing. A cold knot tightened in Nayeli's stomach. This was not the idle curiosity of a passing traveler. This was a gaze, deliberate and assessing, and it made the hairs on her arms stand on end. She tried to ignore him, to pour all her focus into the arduous task before her, but his presence was a constant, irritating hum beneath the surface of her concentration. He represented the world she had sought to escape, the world that had stolen her husband, the world that saw her land as empty, waiting to be claimed. He was a symbol of the relentless hunger that drove men across these lands, a hunger that often consumed everything in its path. Her back ached, her joints screamed with protest, but she straightened, her chin lifting slightly, a silent challenge thrown across the vast empty space that separated them. Let him watch. Let him see her labor, her defiance. This was her ground, consecrated by her sweat and sorrow, and she would not yield it easily. The air itself seemed to thicken with an unspoken tension, a silent standoff between the unwavering will of one woman and the looming shadow of an unknown, powerful man. One afternoon, as the sun dipped towards the western peaks, casting long, distorted shadows across the nascent walls of her cabin. The silent observer finally broke the unseen barrier. He rode closer, a figure of imposing stature atop a magnificent roan horse, its coat gleaming like polished copper in the fading light. He was a man of the New World, dressed in the finest leather and sturdy canvas, a wide-brimmed hat shielding eyes she could not yet discern. Elias Thorne, a name whispered with a mixture of awe and resentment among the few settlers she had encountered, was a man who owned land as far as the eye could see, or so the rumors claimed. He stopped a respectful distance away, not dismounting, but his gaze, when it finally met hers, was direct, unyielding, and utterly devoid of warmth. Nayeli felt a chill deeper than the evening air. She stopped sawing, the rhythmic rasp of the blade dying into silence. The only sound was the faint whistle of the wind and the soft snort of his horse. He spoke then, his voice a low rumble, surprisingly polite, yet carrying an undeniable edge of authority, a subtle command that made her hackles rise. "That's quite a feat you're attempting, ma'am." Alone. He didn't ask a question, merely stated an observation, as if cataloging a curious anomaly. Nayeli said nothing, her hand instinctively going to the small, sharp knife she kept tucked into her belt. Her eyes, dark and unwavering, held his. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken meaning. It was then, as she stared into the stark blue of his eyes, that a memory, sharp and sudden, pierced the veil of her grief. "The land is not yours to take, my love. It is merely loaned to us by the spirits, for our time." Her husband's voice, resonant with ancient wisdom, echoed in her mind. He had spoken those words on the day they had first walked this very stretch of land, dreaming of a future that had since shattered like fragile pottery. This man, Elias Thorne, represented everything her husband had fought against, everything he had warned her about. He saw land as property, a commodity to be bought and sold, not a living entity to be cherished. His presence was an affront, a desecration. "I am not alone," Nayeli finally spoke, her voice low, raspy from disuse but firm, her gaze flicking down to her belly for a fleeting moment before returning to his, a silent declaration that transcended mere words. Thorne's expression remained unreadable, but a flicker, perhaps of surprise, perhaps of something else entirely, crossed his eyes before he turned his horse and rode away, leaving behind a lingering sense of unease, like a predator circling its prey. The cowboy's visits became more frequent, his presence a dark stain on the periphery of Nayeli's arduous days. He would appear at different times, sometimes in the early morning mist, a silent sentinel, sometimes in the harsh glare of noon, his form etched against the brilliant sky. He never stayed long, never spoke more than a few clipped sentences, but his observation was relentless, a constant pressure. "You're making good progress," he'd remark, his voice a low hum that grated against her nerves. Or, "Looks like rain's coming. That roof won't hold it." Each comment, seemingly innocuous, carried a veiled condescension, an unspoken challenge to her capabilities. Nayeli's responses were terse, if any at all. She would simply nod or grunt, or simply turn her back, resuming her labor with a renewed, almost furious intensity. Her silence was her shield, her ceaseless work her defiant answer. She would not give him the satisfaction of a verbal sparring match. She would show him, through the rising walls of her sanctuary, the strength he seemed so determined to measure. The cabin, now taking on the distinct shape of a small dwelling, became a focal point of this silent battle. Every log she fitted, every nail she hammered, was an assertion of her right to be there, to build, to exist without his permission or his judgment. The very air around her thrummed with the unspoken conflict, a tension that stretched taut between them, invisible yet undeniably present. She could feel his gaze on her, a physical weight, and she often imagined his eyes stripping away her meager defenses, assessing her vulnerability, her determination. But with each sunrise she found herself rising again, her body aching, her spirit unbent. The image of her unborn child, a fragile flicker of hope within her, was the fire that stoked her resolve. She pictured the small, safe space within the cabin, the warmth of a fire, the soft furs, a haven for the life she carried. This vision pushed her forward, compelled her to ignore the chill of his gaze, the weight of his unspoken intentions. The land, once a comforting presence, now felt like a contested arena, her solitary struggle amplified by the constant, watchful presence of the man who sought to claim it, or perhaps, simply to understand the anomaly of her unwavering will. As weeks turned into months, the cabin began to emerge from the earth, a testament to Naeli's unyielding spirit. Its walls, rough but sturdy, rose towards the sky, promising shelter. Yet the cowboy's presence grew more insistent, a shadow that stretched further into her days. He started leaving things, a neatly stacked pile of cut wood at the edge of her clearing one morning, a fresh haunch of venison another, laid silently by her cooking fire. These gestures, though seemingly benevolent, felt like an insult, a subtle undermining of her self-sufficiency. They were a reminder of her precarious situation, of the vast difference in their worlds, and of his power. Naeli would use the wood, she would cook the meat, but a bitter taste lingered. She never acknowledged these gifts, never offered a word of thanks, allowing the silent tension to remain unbroken. He understood. His offers were not kindness. They were a subtle assertion of dominance, a way of inserting himself into her life, of making her beholden to him. Her memories, once a soothing balm, now seemed to churn with unease. A specific flashback, sharper than the others, began to surface. The day the land agents came, their faces hard, their words like stones thrown against her people's ancient claims. Her husband, strong and defiant, standing before them, speaking of treaties, of promises, of the sacredness of the earth. He had argued, pleaded, fought with words, but their words had been backed by the gleam of metal, the threat of eviction. He had spoken of her people's deep roots, of generations buried beneath this soil, of the river's song echoing their ancestors' voices. They had scoffed. Unoccupied land, they had declared, ripe for development. It was then, seeing the glint of the setting sun on the polished boots of the lead agent, that Elias Thorne had ridden past, briefly, unknowingly, a casual observer to their pain. He had worn the same air of detached confidence, the same expensive clothing. The memory now tainted his current kindness with a deeper, more sinister hue. She saw the same indifference, the same casual disregard for her heritage, her inherent right. The cabin, her last refuge, felt increasingly vulnerable, a small, fragile shell against the relentless tide of their ambition. He wanted this land. Of that she was now certain. Her strength, her raw, defiant will, was simply an obstacle he hadn't anticipated, an intriguing challenge in his calculated acquisition. The unspoken contest intensified, shifting from mere observation to a palpable confrontation of wills. Elias Thorne, no longer content with silent gestures, began to voice his intentions, albeit subtly at first. "This land, ma'am," he began one cool morning, dismounted, his boots sinking slightly into the still damp earth. He gestured expansively, his arm sweeping across the horizon, encompassing everything Naeli saw as her home. "It's rich, good for grazing. I could offer you a fair price for it. More than fair, considering you're alone." His eyes, cold as winter rivers, flickered to her swelling belly, a direct, deliberate acknowledgement of her vulnerability. Naeli stopped hammering, the sound of metal on wood abruptly silenced. She turned, her gaze, unwavering and fierce, locking onto his. "It is not for sale," she stated, her voice a low growl, each word a stone thrown at his arrogance. Her language was simple, stripped bare of flowy rhetoric, but it carried the weight of generations, the echo of her ancestors. The air grew heavy, thick with the unspoken history of appropriation and resistance. Thorne's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath his sun-bronzed skin. He was unaccustomed to such blunt defiance, especially from a woman, and a native woman at that. He embodied the pervasive societal bias of the era, the belief in manifest destiny, the inherent right of the civilized to claim and tame the wilderness, and its inhabitants along with it. "Everything has a price, ma'am," he countered, his voice losing its veneer of politeness, hardening into something sharp and unyielding. "And this land, it will be developed, with or without you." The threat, though unspoken, hung heavy in the air, a shadow falling over the rising walls of her cabin. Nayeli felt a primal surge of anger, hot and wild, course through her veins. This land was not just soil and grass. It was the bones of her people, the spirit of her ancestors, the cradle of her future child. To sell it would be to sell her very soul. Her hands, calloused and strong, tightened into fists, the image of her husband's grave flashing behind her eyes. He had died protecting what was theirs, and she would honor his memory. "Not this," she declared, her voice rising, infused with a raw, undeniable power that seemed to ripple through the silence. "Not my home, not my child's birthright." The defiance in her eyes was a burning fire, meeting the cold ambition in his, a testament to the fact that some things, indeed, have no price. The tension, stretched taut for months, finally snapped. Thorn, accustomed to having his will obeyed, pushed past the boundaries of polite intimidation. He arrived not alone, but with two rough-looking men, their faces hardened by sun and suspicion, their hands resting loosely on the pistols holstered at their hips. They were an extension of his power, a blunt instrument wielded against her solitary resistance. "I've made my offer, ma'am," Thorn began, his voice devoid of any pretense of courtesy, flat and menacing. "And now, I'm simply stating facts. This land belongs to the county by right of purchase. Your dwelling is an illegal encroachment." He gestured dismissively at the nearly completed cabin, its sturdy frame a monument to her relentless effort. Nayeli stood before her half-finished doorway, her pregnant silhouette framed against the dark interior of her nascent home, a vulnerable yet unyielding figure. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild drumbeat of fear and fury. This was it, the direct assault she had anticipated. Her eyes, wide and luminous with defiance, darted between the three men, assessing the threat. "This land is mine," she countered, her voice surprisingly steady, though it trembled with barely suppressed emotion. "It has been my people's for generations. Your papers mean nothing here. They are lies written on stolen ground." One of Thorn's men chuckled, a low, guttural sound of derision. "Listen to the squaw, boss. Thinks she owns the whole damn prairie." The insult, laced with venom and prejudice, struck Nayeli like a physical blow. Her face remained impassive, but her eyes, usually soft with a deep, quiet sadness, blazed with a righteous anger that momentarily startled even Thorn. She saw in their faces the same cold disregard that had swept through her village, that had left her an orphan, then a widow. The weight of her ancestors, of all the stolen lands and broken promises, settled upon her shoulders. She would not let this land, this last sanctuary, be taken from her. The air crackled with an almost visible energy, the clash of two worlds, two fundamental beliefs, hanging precariously in the balance. Her hands instinctively went to her belly, a protective gesture, a silent vow to the life within her that she would fight, to her last breath, for their right to exist in peace on this sacred earth. The confrontation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, each word a stone flung between two vastly different worlds. Thorn's men shifted, their hands twitching towards their holsters, an unspoken threat. Nayeli stood firm, a living embodiment of the land itself, rooted, unyielding, scarred but unbroken. She knew the odds were against her. 3 armed men against 1 pregnant woman, her only defense the unfinished walls of her cabin and the fierce fire in her soul. But retreat was not an option. To yield now would be to betray everything she was, everything her ancestors had fought for, everything her husband had died for. It would be to surrender her child's future to the rapacious grasp of those who saw the earth as nothing more than a resource to be plundered. She took a slow, deliberate breath, the scent of pine and damp earth filling her lungs. Her eyes, fixed on Thorn, conveyed a message far more potent than any words she could speak. The boundless, desperate courage of a mother protecting her young, the ancient wisdom of a people clinging to their heritage. "You may take my life," Nayeli stated, her voice surprisingly calm, almost a whisper, yet it cut through the tense silence like a sharpened flint. "But you will not take this land. It is soaked in the blood of my kin, blessed by the spirits of generations. It will never truly be yours." Her gaze held his, piercing through his hardened facade, revealing, for a fleeting instant, a flicker of something akin to discomfiture in his cold eyes. He had expected pleas, tears, perhaps even desperate bargaining. He had not anticipated such unshakable conviction, such a profound connection to the very ground beneath their feet. The raw, primal force of her defiance seemed to ripple outwards, unsettling his men, who exchanged uneasy glances. This was not a simple land dispute. This was a clash of fundamental truths, a battle for the very soul of the wilderness. The sun, sinking lower, cast long, distorted shadows, turning the figures into ancient adversaries, locked in an eternal struggle. The cabin, her half-built sanctuary, stood silent witness, its raw wood absorbing the unspoken drama, ready to bear the weight of whatever was to come. The stakes were no longer just property. They were identity, heritage, and the fragile, precious flicker of a future yet to be born. The standoff stretched, moments elongating into an eternity, each breath drawn a fragile thread in the taut silence. Thorn, for all his bluster and cold calculation, found himself staring into eyes that held the weight of 1,000 suns, a resolve he had rarely encountered. His own power, usually absolute, seemed to falter against the raw, uncompromising strength of her spirit. He had anticipated resistance, but not this unwavering, almost sacred defiance. He saw not just a pregnant woman, but an ancient force, a conduit to the earth itself. The silence was broken by a sudden, sharp gasp from Nayeli, a spasm of pain rippling through her body. Her hand flew to her swollen belly, her face momentarily contorting, the raw fear of her impending labor briefly overriding her iron will. This unexpected vulnerability, stark and undeniable, seemed to pierce through Thorn's hardened shell. He had viewed her as an obstacle, a symbol of the savage wilderness to be tamed. But in that moment, she was simply a woman, vulnerable and in pain, on the cusp of bringing new life into a hostile world. It was a truth that resonated, however faintly, even within his ambition-driven heart. The image of his own mother, long gone, flashed unbidden into his mind, a memory of tenderness, of fierce protection, the sheer audacity of her single-handed struggle, the tenacity that had brought the cabin this far, suddenly took on a new dimension, far removed from mere property disputes. He saw the strength he had observed, not as a challenge to be conquered, but as something profound, almost miraculous. "Get back to the horses," Thorn snapped, his voice rough, surprising his men who looked at him with confusion. "Both of you, now." They hesitated, then, sensing the shift in his tone, slowly backed away. He turned back to Nayeli, her breaths coming in ragged gasps now, her eyes, though clouded with pain, still holding that fierce, unyielding light. The rigid lines of his face softened, almost imperceptibly. The rich cowboy, for once, saw beyond the land, beyond the perceived right of ownership, to the raw, undeniable force of life itself. The air, though still charged, seemed to lose its sharp, hostile edge, replaced by a complex, unsettling stillness as the true weight of her solitary struggle descended upon them both. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the western sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, a dramatic backdrop to the fading confrontation. Thorn's men were a distant murmur, their horses' hooves fading into the vast silence of the plains. Only he remained, a solitary figure watching Nayeli, who now leaned heavily against the rough-hewn doorframe of her cabin, her body racked with tremors, the pains coming in relentless waves. The air around her pulsed with the raw, primal energy of birth. He had come to claim land, to impose his will, but the sheer, undeniable force of her struggle had stripped away the layers of his calculated ambition, revealing a sliver of something he had long suppressed, a grudging respect, an unsettling empathy. He watched as she staggered, almost falling, her breath catching in her throat, a small, choked cry escaping her lips. The sight was undeniably powerful, a stark tableau of vulnerability and immense strength. He saw her now not as an adversary, not as a symbol of the other, but simply as a human being facing the most profound and terrifying transition of life, utterly alone. His own life, filled with acquisition and dominance, suddenly felt hollow, strangely small in comparison to the immense, courageous act unfolding before him. The land which he had coveted seemed to sigh around them, bearing witness to a different kind of claiming, one born not of ownership, but of sacrifice and creation. He was a man of his time, steeped in the ingrained biases of his culture, yet Nayeli's unwavering spirit had chipped away at the edifice of his prejudice. He remained silent, allowing the vastness of the moment to fill the space between them. The only sound, the escalating rhythm of her breathing, the occasional grunt of pain. The cabin, her sanctuary, now became a symbolic crucible, a place where a new life would emerge, a life born of defiance, resilience, and the unshakable will of a single woman. The hope that had been a faint flicker throughout Nayeli's arduous journey now seemed to burn with a fierce, unwavering intensity, illuminating the darkening plains. Days later, the scent of wood smoke mingled with something new in the air, the faint, sweet scent of new life. Thorn, driven by an unnamed impulse he couldn't quite articulate, had returned. He approached cautiously, his horse moving at a walk, as if fearing to disturb the fragile peace that now seemed to settle over the cabin. The doorway was no longer merely a frame. It was a threshold, crossed by the birth of a new future. As he drew closer, he saw her, Nayeli, sitting by a small, crackling fire outside the cabin, her face etched with exhaustion, but alight with a quiet, profound joy. In her arms, swaddled in a soft blanket, was a tiny bundle, a sleeping infant. The sight was startling in its simple beauty, a stark contrast to the rough wilderness surrounding them and the harshness of their previous encounters. He dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, and stood a respectful distance away. Nayeli looked up, her eyes meeting his, no longer blazing with defiance, but holding a deep, ancient wisdom. There was no triumph in her gaze, no lingering anger, only a quiet acknowledgement of a shared, undeniable moment of humanity. The fierce battle for land had yielded to the silent, undeniable miracle of life. "A daughter," she said, her voice soft, barely above a whisper, filled with an emotion so pure it seemed to resonate in the very air around them. Thorn merely nodded, words failing him, the familiar arguments and demands rendered meaningless in the face of such raw, untamed existence. He saw the scars on her hands, the weariness in her shoulders, the relentless strength that had built this small haven and brought forth this new life. The cabin stood behind her, finished, sturdy, a monument not to his ambition, but to her indomitable will. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that this land, this small patch of earth, was hers in a way no paper or decree could ever define. It was consecrated by birth, by survival, by the unwavering spirit of a woman who had, with her bare hands, carved hope from the unyielding wilderness. The memory of the sun setting on their confrontation, the raw vulnerability of her pain, now seemed like a distant echo, replaced by the profound quietude of this new beginning. The sun climbed, bathing the plains in a golden light, illuminating the small cabin that stood as a testament to an unyielding spirit. Nayeli watched Elias Thorn ride away, his silhouette fading into the vast expanse from which he had come. He left no promises, no peace treaty, but in his departure, there was an unspoken understanding, a subtle shift in the balance of their shared world. He had seen her strength, not merely as an obstacle, but as a force of nature, primal and unyielding, and in that seeing, something within him had irrevocably changed. The land, once a battleground, now breathed with a quiet solace, accepting her, protecting her, echoing the whispers of her ancestors. Nayeli turned her gaze from the horizon to the small, perfect face nestled against her breast. Her daughter, her future, the embodiment of her fierce survival. The scars on Nayeli's hands, once symbols of arduous labor, were now woven into the tapestry of her life, each one a testament to the battles fought and won. The cabin, her safe haven, stood strong, its timbers imbued with her sweat, her tears, her unshakable will. It was more than a structure. It was a beacon, a living, breathing testament to resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. The journey had been arduous, fraught with tension and shadowed by grief, but the resolution, though perhaps not fairy tale perfect, was imbued with a deep, grounded hope. The dark days had given way to a dawn of quiet triumph. Her path was hers now, carved by her own hands, guided by the whispers of the wind and the ancient songs of her people. The land stretched out, boundless and wild, holding both the pain of the past and the boundless promise of tomorrow. And Nayeli, the pregnant widow who built a home with her bare hands, would raise her daughter under its vast, watchful sky, teaching her the true meaning of strength, not in conquest, but in enduring, in creating, in simply being. The story of her defiance would be woven into the fabric of this land, a silent, powerful legend for generations to come.